The line was already breaking when the final reports arrived. Not retreating, breaking. Gaps were opening faster than they could be closed, units were losing cohesion, and German spearheads were pressing forward with a momentum that threatened to split the front entirely. Zhukov did not need a briefing to understand what this meant. He had seen this pattern before, and he knew how quickly it ended when hesitation crept in. If the breakthrough succeeded, entire armies could be encircled within days. Cities would fall, supply lines would collapse, there would be no orderly withdrawal, only disintegration. This was the moment commanders feared most, when no good options remained, only necessary ones. Zhukov looked at the maps, then at the casualty estimates already climbing into the tens of thousands, and made a decision that would define both the battle and his legacy. The line would not be allowed to move, whatever it cost. On the Eastern Front, defense was not a passive act, it was an act of consumption. Terrain offered little protection, weather punished movement, and enemy artillery and armor exploited every weakness with ruthless efficiency. Zhukov understood that a flexible defense would fail here. There was simply no space to bend without snapping. His order was brutally clear: commit reserves immediately, directly into the collapsing sectors, and hold ground at all costs. These were not elite formations being thrown in under ideal conditions. Many units were under strength, hastily assembled, or exhausted from previous fighting. They advanced into positions already under heavy fire, often without full artillery preparation or reliable air cover. There was no illusion of a counterstroke or decisive victory. The objective was delay, to force the enemy to slow down, to regroup, to bleed time. In that equation, speed mattered more than survival. Battalion commanders understood what the orders implied the moment they received them. Some protested, most did not. The Red Army had learned through bitter experience that refusal was rarely an option and delay could be fatal. As the fighting intensified, losses mounted with terrifying speed. Units that entered the line at dawn were reporting catastrophic casualties by midday. Communications broke down as officers were killed and command posts overrun. Reinforcements were fed in piecemeal, not because this was sound doctrine, but because there was no alternative left. Every hour the line held denied the enemy operational freedom. Every kilometer not surrendered complicated their logistics and disrupted their tempo. Zhukov tracked the situation relentlessly, measuring success not in ground gained, but in minutes stolen from the enemy's advance. The cost was becoming clear even before the day ended. Medical units were overwhelmed. Equipment losses went unrecorded. Entire formations ceased to exist as functional units. Yet the front, though scarred and uneven, did not collapse. It held, not through strength, but through saturation. Zhukov had achieved exactly what he intended. The enemy was slowed, the breakthrough was blunted, and the price, already approaching 6 figures, was accepted without hesitation. Behind the line, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Medical stations overflowed within hours, their capacity shattered by the volume of wounded. Evacuation routes clogged with vehicles carrying men who would never return to combat, while others were turned away for lack of transport or space. Equipment losses mounted alongside human ones, artillery abandoned when crews were killed, tanks disabled and left where they burned, small arms discarded in the chaos of repositioning. None of this was accidental. Zhukov's orders had accepted these outcomes as inevitable. The purpose was not to preserve units, but to preserve time. Each destroyed battalion forced the enemy to pause, reorganize, and commit additional resources. Each stalled advance disrupted carefully planned timetables that depended on speed. The line held not because it was reinforced with steel, but because it was reinforced with bodies. As dawn approached, the scale of the sacrifice became unmistakable. Units committed only hours earlier reported casualty rates that would have shattered morale in most armies. Officers were replaced by sergeants, then by corporals, until command itself became a matter of survival rather than coordination. Yet, despite the disintegration at the tactical level, the strategic effect was undeniable. The breakthrough Zhukov feared had not materialized. Enemy spearheads were bogged down, their supply lines stretched, and their initiative blunted. The decision to commit reserves without regard for losses had achieved its immediate goal. But it also locked the Red Army into a brutal reality. Holding the line had come at a cost that could not be undone. The question now was no longer whether the decision had worked, but whether the Soviet war effort could absorb what it had just spent, and how long such a strategy could be sustained before the price became unbearable. In the days that followed, the battlefield fell eerily quiet, not because the war had paused, but because both sides were recalibrating after a shock they had not anticipated. For the enemy, the expected breakthrough had failed to materialize. Timetables were shattered. Units that were meant to surge forward were instead bogged down, reorganizing amid unexpected resistance and mounting losses of their own. For Zhukov, however, the silence carried a different weight. As consolidated reports arrived, the scale of what had been expended became impossible to obscure. Casualty figures climbed relentlessly, passing thresholds that even seasoned staff officers struggled to process. Entire divisions had been reduced to shadows of their former strength. Some formations existed only on paper, their numbers maintained in reports because admitting their destruction served no immediate purpose. Zhukov did not dispute the figures. He had anticipated them. What mattered now was whether the time bought with those lives could be converted into something permanent. That conversion began almost immediately. Reinforcements, previously too distant to matter, reached stabilized sectors. Defensive depth was restored just enough to prevent renewed collapse. Artillery concentrations increased. Supply lines, once on the verge of rupture, were reorganized under the cover of the stalled front. The enemy, denied momentum, was forced into a slower, more deliberate campaign, one that played to Soviet strengths in manpower and industrial replacement. This was the strategic logic behind Zhukov's decision, and in cold operational terms, it worked. The line that had been on the brink of annihilation now existed again as a coherent front. The war did not turn that day, but it failed to turn against the Soviet Union. That distinction mattered more than victory in the immediate sense. On the Eastern Front, survival itself was often the objective. Zhukov never publicly framed the decision as heroism, nor did he deny its brutality. In post-war reflections and internal discussions, the logic remained consistent. Losing the line would have meant losing everything that followed it. Cities, armies, and strategic depth would have been consumed in rapid succession. The sacrifice of 100,000 men was not presented as acceptable in isolation. It was presented as unavoidable in context. That framing has haunted assessments of Zhukov's leadership ever since. To some, it confirmed his reputation as a commander willing to spend lives to achieve results. To others, it demonstrated an unflinching realism demanded by a war where failure carried existential consequences. What cannot be disputed is this. At that moment, Zhukov chose certainty over mercy. He traded lives for time, and time for survival. The line held, the war continued, and the cost of that decision remains one of the most sobering examples of command under absolute pressure in World War II.